China has been bullying its neighbors for years, thanks to the size of its military and that sweet, sweet Chinese money. And now, its bullying is coming back to bite it. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. We are seeing a major change in the balance of power against the Chinese Communist Party. China's neighbors, many of whom used to be either friendly or at least not hostile to China, are starting to wake up to the China threat. And they're doing something about it. Australia is beefing up its military specifically in response to China. The Philippines, under new President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has moved back to closer ties with the United States, allowing the U.S. to expand its military presence there. Even countries that kinda hate each other, like Japan and South Korea, have been teaming up because of the China threat. Now don't get me wrong, China still has a lot of economic influence in the region. It's still heavily embedded in many countries' economies, thanks to all the cheap stuff it makes. In fact, for these countries, China is still their #1 trading partner. Yes, even Taiwan. I guess the constant threat of invasion and internment camps isn't enough to dissuade some people from doing business with China. That's no longer enough to get many of them to kowtow to Beijing, or at least not like they used to. Let me use South Korea as an example. China is by far its largest trading partner. South Korea and China also share historical grievances with Japan over atrocities it committed before and during World War II. For example, in 2018, South Korea's Supreme Court ordered some Japanese businesses to compensate South Koreans they exploited for forced labor during World War II. There were also protests in South Korea about Japan's plan to release water in its Fukushima nuclear reactor into the ocean, though that might have been less about World War II and more about not wanting three-eyed fishes. And then there's the territorial disputes the two have had for decades. You might think that two large liberal democracies so close to each other would be on good terms, but for decades, that hasn't been the case. The Chinese Communist Party has definitely played up that wedge issue to keep South Korea and Japan from teaming up against China now. But after years of animosity between the two, South Korea and Japan are burying the hatchet. Mainly because if they don't, this hatchet might bury them. Get what I mean? South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol visited Tokyo in March, and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida visited Seoul earlier this month, which is the first time in 12 years they've had regular high-level meetings. They've also agreed to share more intelligence with each other. And Yoon said that he was open to Japan joining an intelligence sharing agreement he recently made with the U.S. That pact gives South Korea real-time access to intel about North Korea's missile launches and a say in how the U.S. responds. China hates that kind of thing. Why? Well, why do you think China was so upset about the THAAD missile defense system the U.S. installed to help counter North Korea? Because someday, that could be used against Chinese missiles. This is really big. Former South Korean President Moon Jae-in was close with China, and he promised South Korea wouldn't form a trilateral security alliance between the U.S. and Japan. And even though nothing like that has officially happened, China is less than thrilled. As my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, says, blindly following the U.S. and Japan will only turn South Korea into a chess piece. Yeah, China is the only country that can use South Korea as its pawn. China's military was even put on high alert over the growing U.S., Japan, and South Korea ties. Now, South Korea has always walked a tightrope between the U.S. and Beijing. Like I said earlier, China is South Korea's biggest trading partner, and it relied on China, mostly for the worst, to mediate with North Korea. But the U.S. is the one that's promised to defend South Korea with its nuclear weapons if North Korea or China attacks. Now, besides a few hiccups, South Korea has managed to balance that relationship. But with China's increasing military aggression, a choice had to be made, and Yoon so far is choosing the U.S. You can see by the big change in how Chinese state-run media talks about him. He was China's preferred candidate during the election. Now he's holding extreme policy positions that threaten regional peace and security. Befriending Japan isn't the only way South Korea has broken away from China either. Last year, Yoon gave a speech at a NATO summit in Madrid, where he warned about a threat to universal values. While he didn't name China specifically, an official attending the closed-door speech said he implied China was one of those threats. This was also the first time a South Korean president attended a NATO summit. Even though South Korea isn't a NATO member, it is a partner of NATO, which is something that irks China to no end. That's because NATO is starting to look at China as the new Russia. But South Korea wasn't the only first-time NATO attendee. Also attending for the first time from the Indo-Pacific were NATO partners Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And as you can see by Chinese state-run media, they're scared a military bloc is forming to counter the Chinese Communist Party. And it's got reason to be worried. At that summit, NATO members voted on a strategic concept document that for the first time ever called out China as a security challenge. It said China's stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interests, security, and values. Challenge our interests, security, and values. I think that's probably the understatement of the year. China has a full assault on all of those. Doesn't just end there, though. Now the U.S. says NATO plus the four nations will agree to create a roadmap for expanded cooperation. Speaking of NATO, Japan has further angered China by asking NATO for a liaison office to be set up in Tokyo. Nikkei Asia, which broke the story, said it was because of increased aggression from China and Russia's war in Ukraine. China's ambassador to the Korean Peninsula warned on Twitter that this would stoke camp confrontation, which is probably the wrong message to send if China doesn't want all the Indo-Pacific countries joining NATO. After all, one of Russia's reasons for invading Ukraine was to keep NATO from expanding on its border. Now that it's invaded Ukraine, its border with NATO is twice as long as it was before. And China has definitely never threatened to invade any other countries, certainly has no border conflicts with any other countries, and definitely no trade wars, or cases where it just shot missiles at its neighbors for no reason. No, according to China, NATO's continual eastward expansion in the Asia-Pacific attempts to destroy regional peace and stability. Yes, it's NATO that's threatening to make the oh-so-peaceful Asia-Pacific less peaceful. But as I said, it's not just South Korea and Japan that are teaming up to fight China. Other countries are preparing for confrontation as well. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. Thanks to China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific, China is pushing America's Asian allies closer together. I mentioned how South Korea and Japan are bearing the hatchet. Well, South Korea appears to be rethinking its relationship with Taiwan as well. Earlier this month, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol told Reuters that the Taiwan issue is not simply an issue between China and Taiwan, but like the issue of North Korea, it is a global issue. As you can imagine, China didn't like that sentiment. It summoned South Korea's ambassador and basically told South Korea to mind its own business. Then a week later, China again summoned a South Korean diplomat. This time it was over U.S. President Joe Biden and Yoon releasing a statement that mentioned Taiwan. The statement said they wanted to maintain the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and that they opposed any unilateral attempts to change the status quo. Which is hardly a controversial statement unless you don't want peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. I'm starting to think China's showing its cards a little too openly these days. But in the past, South Korea basically tried to avoid the Taiwan issue. Japan is also taking a more proactive stance on Taiwan. Its leaders started saying in 2021 that an invasion of Taiwan would be seen as a threat to their own national security. That's a big deal, because Japan's constitution basically prohibits it from having a military. It can only have a self-defense force, but by classifying Taiwan as a Japanese national security issue, that paves the way for Japan to respond with force in the event of a Taiwan invasion. Since then, it's formalized that view in several policy documents, including its most recent national defense strategy. And thanks to China, last year, Japan announced a plan to double its military budget. Taiwan is just 70 miles from Japan's closest island. So if China were to take over Taiwan, this would put China right on Japan's doorstep. But more importantly, Since the U.S. has military bases in Japan, it would make Japan a target. Japan's other big concern is shipping access. The Taiwan Strait is the main passage for cargo moving between Southeast Asia and Japan, South Korea and northern China. It's one of the world's busiest waterways, used every year by almost half the world's container ships. So yeah, an invasion of Taiwan would be a big deal. And not just for Japan. As the UK Foreign Minister says, it could destroy global trade. Japan isn't the only one upping its defense spending, though. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. China has become increasingly aggressive in the Indo-Pacific, and its neighbors are starting to prepare for the worst. Earlier this year, China's Fujian Maritime Safety Administration announced that for 3 days, it would inspect ships in the Taiwan Strait, including by boarding them. China claimed this was to ensure the safety of ships and ensure the orderly operation of key water projects. But it suspiciously occurred right before Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen and U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy met in California last month. In 2021, China passed a law that gave its Coast Guard the right to use weapons in the South China Sea. That law actually didn't define where it could police, so China's Coast Guard could go to at least the first island chain, if not beyond. This zealous policing law and China's threats to randomly inspect ships is just one of the reasons China's neighbors are preparing for conflict. China also has territorial conflicts with most of its neighbors. Its militarized islands in the South China Sea and its terrifying fishing fleets have harassed waters as far away as Ecuador. For years, China talked about win-win cooperation. But the mask is off. As I said, Australia is upping its defense spending. So is New Zealand. India is also increasing its defense budget. Indian soldiers have actually died fighting Chinese troops on a disputed border. The Pentagon is also stepping up its cooperation with India. While the Pentagon hasn't yet confirmed this, a report earlier this year said U.S. intelligence helped prevent a China incursion into India. Now, all of this is a good sign. But what none of these countries seem to be taking seriously is how much leverage China still has over them economically. As I said, China is their biggest trading partner. That is their Achilles heel. Even the U.S. is so dependent on trade with China that the Biden administration only wants to de-risk from China, not decouple. South Korea still pledges closer ties. So does Japan, and Australia, and New Zealand, and even Taiwan. Because apparently, just threatening to kill you is not enough to turn people off Chinese money. And this show would not exist without support from viewers like you. YouTube frequently demonetizes, suppresses, and secretly unsubscribes people from this channel. Join what I call the China Uncensored 50-cent army by joining the show on the crowdfunding website Patreon. That's patreon.com/ChinaUncensored. You'll get a bunch of cool perks, including the ability to ask me questions I'll answer on the show. And today's question comes from David Michael White. Chris, what is the celebration plan once the channel reaches 2 million subscribers? Excellent question, David. Unfortunately, I was just talking to someone who said they've been unsubscribed 3 times from the show. That's YouTube secretly unsubscribing him. I hear that from people all the time. Not only is YouTube actively unsubscribing people, they aren't letting subscribers know about new episodes, even if they have the notification bell turned on. For some reason, YouTube is doing everything it can to stop China Uncensored from growing. So I don't know when we'll even make it to 2 million subscribers. But the great thing about contributing to the show on Patreon, besides being the main thing keeping the lights on here at China Uncensored, is Patreon will notify you every time a new episode comes out. You'll never miss one because YouTube didn't tell you. So join up on patreon.com/ChinaUncensored. All it takes is $1 an episode, or you can set a monthly limit. But take a moment and make sure you're still subscribed on YouTube. Best to do that regularly. Thanks for your question and your longtime support, David. And thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.